What do you get when you mix divine entitlement, inherited wealth, and absolutely no self-awareness? British royalty at its absolute dumbest. From kings who lost empires chasing their egos to princes who crashed planes for fun, this isn't history. It's a 2,000-year comedy of errors in velvet and gold. Forget noble bloodlines. These are the 25 biggest idiots in royal history. Arrogant, eccentric, and gloriously unfit for power. Grab your crown, but don't expect it to stay on straight. This is Monarchy, unfiltered, and it's about to get embarrassing. Before we dive into the royal chaos, make sure you subscribe, especially if you enjoy watching powerful people make historically awful decisions. It helps the channel grow, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. While you're here, drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Are you in bed at 2 a.m., questioning the monarchy, or stuck at work pretending this is a documentary? Either way, you're in good company. 1. George IV. George IV had a hangover that cost more than the GDP of some countries. That's not hyperbole. His coronation in 1821, an event meant to solidify his divine right to rule, was a theatrical mess of narcissism, velvet, and cold roast beef that cost the British government nearly £250,000 at the time. That's over $25 million today, spent so a middle-aged man with gout could dress up like a Roman emperor while half the country was unemployed. But really, George's entire life was a coronation hangover. He was the sort of man who mistook indulgence for identity, and unfortunately, Britain mistook him for a king. Even before he technically became monarch, George IV had cultivated an identity as the Prince Regent, a title that sounds grander than it was. His father, George III, had fallen into prolonged periods of mental instability, and Parliament had decided someone had to run things. George IV took the opportunity not to govern, but to party. Not that he partied like a lovable rogue. No, he partied like a bored aristocrat with limitless access to tax money and zero sense of proportion. He bought houses he never slept in, collected art he couldn't pronounce, and commissioned palaces he had no intention of using. He once spent £10,000 on a single outfit for a ball, and legend says it included actual jewels sewn into the fabric. His weight ballooned. His health declined. He couldn't walk upstairs without wheezing. But he still ordered tailor-made boots by the dozens, each one tighter than the last, each one worn once before his swollen ankles rebelled. There was a recurring joke in Parliament. The Prince Regent never met a mirror he didn't salute. That wasn't entirely a joke. George's taste in decor bordered on the psychotic. Take the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, for instance. It's a bizarre architectural Frankenstein, an Orientalist fever dream packed with faux Mughal domes and dragon-themed wallpaper. He built it because he liked the sea air. Then he got bored and built another house somewhere else. Nothing stuck. Nothing satisfied him. The man curated his life like an Instagram influencer with a deep void inside. Now, the British public wasn't entirely amused by this. His subjects were living through the tail end of the Napoleonic Wars, dealing with rising food prices, industrial unrest, and the charming invention of child labor. Meanwhile, their prince was busy arguing with royal decorators about whether the gold trim on his ceiling reflected enough light. By the time his actual coronation arrived, George IV saw it as the ultimate stage. He banned his estranged wife, Queen Caroline, from attending, stationed guards to keep her out, and posed for paintings as if he were descended from the gods themselves. He wore robes trimmed with ermine, carried a jewel-encrusted sword, and commissioned new regalia just for the day. One observer said he looked like a bloated opera tenor cosplaying as Julius Caesar. Another said he smelled like alcohol and mothballs. And after all that, he spent the following weeks recovering from the exertion, complaining of indigestion, sore feet, and emotional strain. That's how you know you've peaked, when your own coronation leaves you too tired to be king. But his reign never got better. He tried to rule, but his main policy contributions involved vetoing Catholic emancipation and spending Parliament's money on repairs to his wine cellars. He became a figure of ridicule, the fat Adonis they called him, with a sneer. Cartoonists had a field day. In one caricature, he's shown choking on a gold spoon while sitting on a throne made of unpaid debts. George IV didn't just live in a bubble, he demanded the bubble be gilded. He once referred to himself, without irony, as the first gentleman of Europe, a man who had never fought in a war, led a reform, or read a full book without falling asleep. But yes, first gentleman. Because nothing says gentleman like bankrupting a nation to build a seaside bachelor pad you'll visit twice. And yet, somehow, this shimmering disaster managed to make the next royal in our story look like a tragic rock star by comparison. After all, it takes a special kind of idiot to lose the respect of both Buckingham Palace and Hollywood. 2. Prince George, Duke of Kent. Prince George, Duke of Kent, was the royal family's original attempt at manufacturing cool. Picture a man born into velvet-lined privilege, who looked in the mirror one day and decided he was going to be the James Dean of the House of Windsor, minus the motorcycle, plus several unnecessary monocles. He was glamorous, scandalous, and just shy of actually achieving anything measurable. And if you squint, you can almost see the tragic charisma. Or maybe that's just the hair pomade reflecting light. Born in 1902, George was the fourth son of King George V, which put him comfortably far from the crown and dangerously close to irrelevance. And when you're that deep in the succession line, you have two options: become a quiet estate-dwelling royal footnote, or turn yourself into a tabloid myth. George chose the second path, if you could even call it a path. It was more like a velvet runway lined with questionable decisions. From an early age, George rejected the gruff, mustache-twirling masculinity of his father's generation. While his brothers were out shooting things and pretending to understand politics, George was busy perfecting the art of silk pocket square placement. He was handsome, sure, in the way that well-lit portraits of aloof men are always handsome. But beneath the cheekbones was a man who never quite understood the difference between attention and admiration. He joined the Navy, then left. Joined the Foreign Office, then left. Took up flying, crashed once. He dipped into the military just long enough to put on a uniform for photo ops, then retreated back into the social whirl of interwar London. And that's where the Duke of Kent truly came alive. Not on the battlefield, not in the boardrooms of diplomacy, but in smoky jazz clubs and velvet-curtained back rooms, swapping jokes with actresses and pretending not to recognize himself on the society pages. There were whispers, so many whispers they could have filled a wing at Kensington Palace. Whispers about secret affairs, whispered tales of drug experimentation, whispered rumors of midnight escapes from Buckingham Palace in disguise. The last one, by the way, is less rumor than verified oddity. According to staff, George would occasionally sneak out of royal residences dressed as a commoner, slipping into nightclubs and Hollywood parties incognito. Because apparently nothing screams commoner like a marquis with perfect teeth pretending he doesn't own a yacht. And the thing is, people loved it. The public had been bludgeoned by the solemnity of George V and the duty-laced drones of royal tradition. Prince George felt like a warm whiskey in winter, indulgent, slightly dangerous, and definitely not part of the national diet. He was the kind of royal who'd show up uninvited, drink your champagne, charm your aunt, and leave you wondering whether he actually existed or was just a lucid dream in a tuxedo. But here's where it turns, because the image, as it usually does, began to fray. George developed a habit of running from the consequences of his own fame. He mistook charisma for character and allure for legacy, and in a strange twist of fate, or cosmic prank, he was eventually pulled into the machinery of war. World War II needed bodies, even pretty ones. And George, in full uniform, re-entered military service as a staff officer. Not quite a hero, not quite a joke, just there. In 1942, he boarded a Sunderland flying boat for what should have been a routine flight. The aircraft crashed in the Scottish Highlands under murky circumstances. Conspiracy theories bloomed like fungus in the shadow of his reputation. Some said sabotage. Others hinted at secret missions. One particularly bizarre claim involved a second unidentified man on the plane, because of course there was. The truth? Likely much simpler and sadder. A man who had spent most of his life trying to avoid the gravity of royal expectations was brought down, quite literally, by the weight of war. And for all the mythos, the champagne, the disguises, and the drama, he left behind very little. A few portraits, some questionable gossip, and a reminder that glamour is a terrible substitute for purpose. Still, if Prince George was the royal who tried to out-charm the system, the next one tried to outright abandon it. He gave up the throne, yes, but he never gave up the spotlight. Because when it came to absurd royal decisions, nobody out-simpered Edward VIII, and that was Prince George, Duke of Kent, a man who turned royal duty into a late-night costume drama. Before we meet the next disaster in line, make sure you're subscribed for more gloriously baffling royal decisions just like this. It's the best way to keep the madness coming. While you're at it, drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Are you halfway through this in the dead of night or casually judging royals over lunch? Either way, you're officially part of the court now. 3. Edward VIII, Duke of Windsor. Edward VIII was the king who couldn't be bothered. Not with statecraft, not with public duty, and certainly not with pretending to enjoy the job he was literally born to do. He ruled for 325 days, less time than it takes to build a moderately ambitious treehouse, and then gave it all up for a woman. But not just any woman. A twice-divorced American socialite named Wallis Simpson, whose very existence caused the British monarchy to collectively clutch its pearls and faint across several counties. Let's be clear, Edward didn't abdicate the throne because of some grand, principled stand against outdated norms. He abdicated because he hated being king and loved being adored. Wallis was just the glittering excuse. For Edward, monarchy wasn't a sacred institution. It was an extremely inconvenient spotlight that kept turning on whenever he tried to go golfing. From the moment he was old enough to be photographed, Edward styled himself less like a future ruler and more like a matinee idol. He perfected the art of appearing busy while doing absolutely nothing. At state functions, he often looked like he was mentally redecorating the room. During royal tours, he treated handshakes like mild allergic reactions. He had the enthusiasm of a man who'd been told he couldn't take naps in velvet. And yet, the public adored him, especially the press. Edward was a walking headline, a dashing, vaguely rebellious prince who said things like, "The modern world must be faced with a modern spirit," which sounded bold until you realized he said it mostly to avoid talking about unemployment. He was style over substance, charm over conviction. And when he finally became king in January 1936, the illusion wore off faster than expected. Because being king isn't a photo shoot. It's paperwork, diplomacy, traditions. Listening to people with bad breath explain land disputes in Gloucestershire. And Edward, within weeks, made it excruciatingly clear that he had no patience for any of it. He skipped briefings, avoided cabinet meetings, and spoke about his coronation as if it were a tedious dinner party he hoped would be cancelled by rain. Then came the scandal. Edward's relationship with Wallis Simpson had been simmering for years, but once he ascended the throne, it went nuclear. The British press, muzzled by tradition and government pressure, stayed quiet, but the American papers had no such reservations. Suddenly, the King of England was being photographed in Mediterranean resorts with a married woman. And the more the establishment panicked, the more Edward dug in his heels. It was a teenage tantrum disguised as a romantic stand. In December 1936, after weeks of political back and forth that had all the subtlety of a family shouting match, Edward abdicated. He gave a radio address, sounding vaguely irritated that people weren't more impressed by his gesture. "I have found it impossible," he said, "to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." Which is a beautiful sentiment, until you remember that the woman in question had fled the country to avoid the spotlight, and Edward had basically handed her a continent-sized mess in the shape of a constitutional crisis. After abdication, Edward became the Duke of Windsor. But he never stopped behaving like royalty. He expected honors, invitations, and red carpets. He resented that his brother, George VI, was now king. He resented not being adored. He resented that Wallis never quite became the fairy tale queen he had imagined. The rest of their lives were spent floating between villas, dinner parties, and lukewarm magazine features. Edward even flirted with fascist sympathies for a time, because nothing says I'm misunderstood quite like meeting with dictators while wearing tailored suits. But in the end, the saddest part of Edward's story isn't that he gave up the throne. It's that he never knew what to do with the freedom. He spent decades sulking in luxury, mistaking exile for tragedy. His final years were a quiet fade into decorative obsolescence. A man remembered more for leaving than leading. Still, he wasn't the last royal to confuse attention for affection. The next prince in our journey tried something similar. Only instead of abdication, he chose a costume party, and the results were historically stupid. 4. Prince Harry. Prince Harry once thought it was a good idea to wear a Nazi uniform to a costume party, and somehow that's not even the most confusing part of his public journey. In January 2005, the British press, never known for restraint, erupted with gleeful outrage. On the front page of The Sun, a 20-year-old Harry, third in line to the throne, grinning in a desert uniform complete with a swastika armband. The headline read, "Harry the Nazi." It was the kind of story you assume is a hoax until you realize no one could make this up. Buckingham Palace scrambled to release an apology, but the image had already gone global. It was offensive, stupid, and above all, bewildering. How could someone raised in the royal echo chamber, a family whose ancestors fought actual Nazis, manage to miss the plot this completely? The answer in part lies in the bizarre halfway house that is royal adolescence. Harry had been sold to the public as the cheeky, relatable royal, less polished than his older brother William, more rebellious, more fun. He was the one you could grab a pint with, except that pint was probably served in a private club with 3 layers of security and a valet who'd met 5 prime ministers. Harry grew up surrounded by tradition, scrutiny, and tabloids that treated him as both mascot and cautionary tale. He lived in palaces, walked behind his mother's coffin in front of millions, and was then expected to smile through press junkets about polo. So it's not hard to imagine why he acted out. But acting out at this scale, dressing as the symbol of one of history's worst regimes, wasn't just tasteless rebellion. It was proof that somewhere between privilege and pressure, Harry had lost the plot. Or worse, never read it in the first place. In the aftermath of the scandal, there were apologies, meetings with Jewish leaders, a forced trip to Auschwitz, which sounds like a punishment from a morally confused Victorian novel. The palace tried to pivot the narrative. Young man makes mistake, learns lesson, emerges wiser. But the cracks were already showing. Harry didn't just lack judgment, he lacked a sense of consequence, and that trait would follow him like a shadow. His military career, to be fair, added a layer of credibility. Harry served in Afghanistan, trained as a helicopter pilot, and did so with genuine commitment. For a while, the press gave him a break. He seemed like he was maturing, moving beyond tabloid headlines into something resembling purpose. But it didn't last. Post-military life brought him back into the gravitational pull of celebrity, and this time, he brought company. Enter Meghan Markle, actress, activist, and, depending on which newspaper you read, either the savior or saboteur of the royal family. Their relationship triggered an avalanche of media coverage that made Harry's Nazi costume look like a warm-up act. Together, they rebranded, retreated, relaunched, and eventually relocated to California, abandoning royal duties with a press release and a podcast. They accused the institution of cruelty, racism, and indifference. The firm, in turn, offered its own brand of silence: icy, polished, deeply British. Harry, for his part, published a memoir, gave interviews, talked about trauma, therapy, family dysfunction, all valid topics. But the tone often felt off, like a man trying to be relatable while still living in a mansion, complaining about privacy from inside a professionally lit living room. He wanted sympathy, but delivered sound bites. Wanted healing, but sold hardcover copies. And through it all, the ghost of that costume party lingered. Because if Harry's journey proved anything, it's that royalty doesn't insulate you from foolishness. It amplifies it. Mistakes made in palaces echo louder, last longer, and end up as museum exhibits or Netflix scenes. What should have been a one-night blunder became a lifelong metaphor. A man caught between image and identity, trapped by the weight of a crown he couldn't carry, but also couldn't entirely let go. Still, for all of Harry's missteps, the next royal in line made even fewer attempts at redemption. His scandals weren't just embarrassing. They were bizarrely defended, unapologetically paraded, and delivered with a level of tone deafness that belongs in a museum exhibit titled, "How Not to Do Damage Control." 5. Prince Andrew, Duke of York. Prince Andrew once did a TV interview so catastrophic it's now studied alongside shipwrecks and oil spills. It was supposed to clear his name. Instead, it sank his reputation with the grace of a flaming blimp. To understand the absurdity of Prince Andrew's self-destruction, you have to understand the royal brand he once represented. He was Air Miles Andy, the dashing Falklands War veteran, Queen Elizabeth's so-called favorite son, a man whose schedule allegedly included more private jet trips than hours in a day. For decades, he hovered on the edges of royal relevance, never essential, never entirely useless. A ceremonial sword on a wall, shiny, decorative, occasionally pointed in the wrong direction. Then came the scandal: Jeffrey Epstein. The disgraced financier had already dragged several public figures into his toxic orbit when Andrew's name began surfacing. Connections were noted, friendships scrutinized. Then came the photograph. Prince Andrew with his arm around a young woman named Virginia Giuffre, who alleged she had been trafficked by Epstein and forced into encounters with Andrew. The photo alone was damning. Andrew claimed he had no recollection of ever meeting her, which might have held more weight if he hadn't been grinning in the picture like a man thrilled to finally understand how a camera works. Pressure mounted. The public wanted answers. Buckingham Palace, in a rare moment of strategic optimism, agreed to a sit-down interview with BBC's Newsnight, hosted by journalist Emily Maitlis. The idea was to end the speculation. What followed was a live-action Greek tragedy performed in monotone. From the moment the cameras rolled, Andrew seemed unaware of why anyone was concerned. He described Epstein's behavior as unbecoming, as if he'd forgotten to wear a tie, rather than being convicted of sex crimes. He claimed that he couldn't have been at the club where Giuffre placed him because he was at a Pizza Express in Woking, a detail so oddly specific it landed somewhere between comedic alibi and performance art. Then came the sweating. Giuffre had described him as perspiring heavily during their alleged encounter. Andrew, with the poise of a man explaining thermodynamics to a skeptical goldfish, claimed he couldn't sweat at the time due to a peculiar medical condition brought on by an adrenaline overdose during the Falklands War. The science was dubious. The optics were worse. Somewhere a royal press officer was eating their resignation letter like a stress snack. The interview aired. The world stared. It wasn't just the content. It was the tone. Andrew seemed smug, robotic, almost bored. There was no remorse, no clarity, no understanding of how badly the situation looked. He treated the whole thing like a minor scheduling conflict rather than a reputational collapse. And when the backlash hit, it was swift and royal. Charities dropped him. Institutions distanced themselves. Buckingham Palace quietly shuffled him out of public duties like an embarrassing uncle at a wedding who's had too much Prosecco and keeps asking about NFTs. Even the Queen, famously stoic in the face of scandal, was reportedly unimpressed. Within weeks, Andrew's royal calendar was empty. His public life effectively ended. Years later, the fallout continued with legal settlements and more damning headlines, each one confirming that the Duke of York had not merely misjudged the situation. He had torched it and then offered to autograph the ruins. What made it worse, uniquely, farcically worse, was that Andrew seemed to think he had done well. He reportedly believed the interview had gone very well under the circumstances, a phrase now reserved for moments when one lights their own reputation on fire and tries to extinguish it with arrogance. And yet, Andrew was not the first royal to be undone by personal absurdity. Long before televised interviews and photographic evidence, there were monarchs whose undoing came not from scandal, but from their appetites. One of them ate so much she had to be carried everywhere in a reinforced chair. 6. Queen Anne. Queen Anne wasn't so much a ruler as she was a cautionary tale about what happens when the crown rests on the shoulders of someone more interested in pastries than politics. She reigned over the union of England and Scotland, the War of the Spanish Succession, and the early stirrings of the British Empire. But all anyone seems to remember is that she had to be carried everywhere in a specially reinforced chair. And frankly, she earned it. Born in 1665 and crowned in 1702, Anne was the last of the Stuart monarchs and possibly the least enthusiastic. Her reign was significant on paper, but largely incidental in execution. Most of the real decisions were made by ministers, generals, and advisors, while Anne presided like an anxious guest of honor at a party she didn't plan and couldn't leave. Anne's life, to be fair, wasn't easy. She suffered from chronic illness, gout, and a tragic series of pregnancies, 17 in total, none of which resulted in a surviving heir. By the time she became queen, she was already physically worn down and emotionally bruised. But what she lacked in stamina, she made up for in snack breaks. Her appetite was legendary. At one point in her reign, her daily meals were so elaborate and constant that palace servants began tracking them like weather patterns. It's said that Anne had a fondness for sweetmeats, roast game, and something charmingly called dripping toast, which sounds like the kind of recipe a medieval doctor would prescribe for melancholy. Over the years, she ballooned in size, reportedly weighing over 200 pounds by the end of her life. This would be unremarkable if it weren't for the fact that palace engineers had to design a custom chair with wheels, padding, and reinforced supports just to move her from room to room. Imagine, if you will, the sovereign of a growing empire being paraded through the halls of state like an exhausted duchess at a buffet. Dignitaries from foreign nations would arrive at court only to be greeted by the sight of Queen Anne, barely mobile, yet swaddled in silks and surrounded by courtiers who pretended not to notice the creaking furniture. Power never looked so upholstered. But Anne wasn't just physically immobile. She was emotionally entangled in drama that makes high school politics look like the United Nations. Most of it revolved around her intense, codependent friendships with her ladies-in-waiting, especially Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough. Sarah was brilliant, charismatic, and politically ambitious, qualities Anne found both intoxicating and infuriating. Their relationship was a roller coaster of whispered secrets, passive-aggressive letters, and the occasional screaming match behind palace doors. When the friendship finally imploded, Anne replaced Sarah with Abigail Masham, a quieter, more pliable confidant who made fewer demands and presumably fewer sarcastic remarks. Sarah, outraged, launched a smear campaign that accused Abigail of manipulating the Queen and accused Anne of, well, being Anne. The court descended into chaos. Ministers took sides. Newspapers speculated wildly. And through it all, Anne sat in her reinforced chair, snacking and sulking, trying to govern a nation while emotionally bench-pressing betrayal. Despite the political milestones of her reign, including the 1707 Act of Union that created Great Britain, Anne herself remained a passive figure in the background, reacting rather than leading. She was not cruel, not foolish in the traditional sense, but she was indecisive, suspicious, and increasingly withdrawn. Ministers often spoke of her as if she were furniture, technically present, frequently in need of repairs, and incapable of initiating change. When she died in 1714, few wept. Her body was so bloated that it took an unusually wide coffin to accommodate her, and 6 strong men to carry it. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. The queen who had spent her reign being carted from room to room left the world in exactly the same fashion, motionless, padded, and weighed down by everything she refused to confront. Still, say what you will about Anne's appetite, at least she didn't set fire to a Royal Navy ship. That particular honor belongs to the next royal on our list, a future king who nearly cooked his own sailors trying to make a midnight snack. 7. Prince George of Cambridge, future George V. Before he was George V, the stoic wartime king with a stiff mustache and an even stiffer personality, Prince George of Cambridge was just another underqualified royal pretending to be a naval officer. He looked the part. He wore the uniform. He stood up straight. But underneath all that brass-button dignity was a young man who once very nearly set his own ship on fire. Not in battle, not by accident, but in the galley, while trying to make toast. Let's back up. Born in 1865, Prince George was never supposed to be king. His older brother, Prince Albert Victor, Eddie, was first in line, which meant George was shuttled off to the Navy, presumably with the hope that he'd come back with a sense of discipline, humility, or, at the very least, a better understanding of how not to burn things. Unfortunately, the training did not take. George was a quiet young man, uninterested in intellectual pursuits and even less interested in taking initiative. His naval career was mostly ceremonial, peppered with polite visits, inspections he barely understood, and frequent complaints about the food. It was during one of these postings, long before his accidental promotion to heir, that he made his mark. Not through valor, but through culinary incompetence. According to naval accounts, young George developed a sudden craving for a late-night snack while stationed aboard a Royal Navy vessel. Refusing to wait for the ship's cook or acknowledge any standard protocol, the prince took it upon himself to fire up one of the galley ovens. What followed was a comedy of errors, the royal equivalent of a toddler playing with a flamethrower. He misjudged the heat settings, used the wrong fuel, and allegedly tossed in a handful of kindling he found lying around. The result? A small smoky fire that forced a partial evacuation of the kitchen and triggered a round of confused alarm bells. Luckily, the fire was contained before it could reach the ammunition stores or the newspapers. But among the crew, the story spread like, well, fire. From that day on, the prince was quietly banned from the galley and unofficially nicknamed Toasty George. In true royal fashion, the incident was never formally documented in public records. But word has a way of seeping through steel hulls, especially when your future monarch nearly flambés his own ship over an ill-advised midnight crumpet. Embarrassing? Yes. Dangerous? Mildly. Symbolic of a larger problem? Absolutely. George's early years were defined by half-hearted attempts to be a working royal, mostly spent trying to pretend that obligation was the same thing as competence. His naval service continued, and he was promoted up the ranks, not because of valor, but because of birthright. By the time he reached flag rank, he'd made it abundantly clear to his subordinates that he was much more comfortable polishing his buttons than making any actual decisions. When Prince Albert Victor died suddenly in 1892, George was thrust into the role of heir, and soon after, king. He transformed into the stiff, duty-bound patriarch remembered from history books, the man who renamed the royal house during World War I to make it sound less German. But beneath that mustached rigidity was still the same man who nearly sank the ship with his snack. This, more than anything, captures the strange moral joke at the heart of royal tradition. The system rewards endurance over ability. George survived the stupidity of his youth not because he learned from it, but because he had the luxury of being insulated from consequences. He became king not through achievement, but attrition. The fire he started in the galley was quietly forgotten, not because it didn't matter, but because the monarchy couldn't afford for it to matter. Still, if George V was a quiet danger to his own ship, the next royal was a loud and deliberate danger to witches. Or rather, to women he was convinced were witches. Because sometimes royal stupidity isn't culinary, it's paranoid metaphysical publishing. Introducing James VI of Scotland, better known to England as James I, and to history as the king who feared broomsticks. 8. James VI of Scotland, later James I of England. If you ever wondered what would happen if a paranoid theology student somehow got promoted to the throne, meet James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, the only monarch in British history who thought the biggest threat to national security was an army of invisible women riding broomsticks. Before he united the crowns in 1603, James ruled over Scotland with the fervor of a man who read too many ghost stories and decided to fact-check them personally. His paranoia was legendary. He wasn't just afraid of being assassinated, he was afraid of being hexed. This wasn't metaphorical. He genuinely believed witches were conspiring against him, casting spells, raising storms, and generally plotting to ruin his hairline. It all started in 1589, when James set sail to Denmark to marry Princess Anne. On the voyage home, a terrible storm hit the fleet. Ships were damaged, nerves were shattered, and James, being James, concluded the only logical explanation: witchcraft. Apparently, the weather gods were not responsible. Middle-aged women in Fife were. He later wrote that the winds had been conjured by devils in the likeness of storm. The more likely cause, bad seamanship and autumn gales, didn't occur to him. Upon returning to Scotland, James ordered an investigation that would make even the most superstitious medieval judge raise an eyebrow. Dozens of women were accused, interrogated, and, tragically, executed. The confessions were absurd. One woman claimed she flew through the night to meet the devil in a churchyard. Another supposedly summoned cats to sink ships. James attended some of the interrogations himself, nodding gravely as if hearing testimony in Parliament. He asked detailed questions about the mechanics of witchcraft, like a student preparing for a final exam in occult stupidity. From this episode came James's proudest intellectual achievement, a book titled Demonology, published in 1597. It's a 16th-century horror anthology disguised as theology. In it, James confidently explains how witches operate, how demons manipulate humans, and why skepticism is practically heresy. He insists that magic is real, witches are everywhere, and disbelief is dangerous. Imagine a royal policy manual written by a man who thinks his nightmares are classified intelligence. When James ascended to the English throne after Elizabeth I's death, he brought his obsessions with him. The English, long accustomed to garden-variety paranoia, suddenly found themselves ruled by a man who saw sorcery in every thunderstorm. He personally approved witch trials, encouraged witch-hunting pamphlets, and turned superstition into soft law. The irony? His reign also oversaw the birth of the King James Bible, a literary masterpiece compiled under the same roof as a monarch who thought wind patterns were demonic Morse code. James's contradictions didn't end there. He fancied himself a scholar, philosopher, and poet. He also believed tobacco caused a stinking breath and a rotting brain, yet his court reeked of cigars. He called himself God's lieutenant on earth, yet he flinched at the sight of eclipses. He spent hours lecturing courtiers about moral conduct and then spent twice as long gossiping about them behind closed doors. He demanded rational governance while consulting astrologers about travel dates. His relationship with his subjects wasn't much better. English nobles thought him odd. Scots thought him pompous. The Puritans thought him heretical. And James, in turn, distrusted almost everyone. He ordered constant surveillance, paranoid that his courtiers were plotting coups. He even had the floors of his chambers reinforced, fearing someone might tunnel underneath to blow him up. Ironically, he wasn't entirely wrong about that. The gunpowder plot of 1605 came terrifyingly close to proving his paranoia right. But instead of rethinking his worldview, James doubled down. To him, the near assassination was yet more proof that dark forces were everywhere. And so, the monarch who helped shape the modern British state also spent his nights worrying about black cats, broomsticks, and the devil's social calendar. His court was both brilliant and bizarre. Shakespeare performed Macbeth, a play about witches, for a king who genuinely believed witches existed. You can almost picture James watching the performance, furrowing his brow and thinking finally, someone's taking this seriously. He died in 1625, surrounded by scholars, priests, and enough suspicion to fill an encyclopedia. To history, he's remembered as the king who gave us one of the greatest literary works ever written, and the monarch who managed to turn supernatural panic into royal policy. And yet, compared to the next royal in our tale, James's fears seem almost quaint. Because if he believed he could heal evil by hunting it, Charles II believed he could heal evil by touching it, literally. The man thought his hands cured disease. 9. Charles II. Charles II believed he had magic hands, healing hands, royal hands. He was so convinced of this mystical power that he would regularly line up sick citizens, sometimes hundreds at a time, and ceremoniously touch them, murmuring prayers and letting his fingers do the divine work. This wasn't performance art or a misunderstood metaphor. It was a public ritual. A monarch-sponsored spa day. A deeply weird chapter in British history, brought to you by one of its most charmingly ridiculous kings. Born in 1630, Charles grew up in exile, watching the English monarchy implode during the Civil War. His father, Charles I, had his head removed by parliamentary displeasure. His family scattered across Europe. So when Charles II finally returned to the throne in 1660 during the Restoration, he didn't just want to be a king. He wanted to be the king. Beloved, stylish, miraculous. A walking, talking symbol of divine right, powdered wigs, and improbable optimism. Enter the king's touch. The practice had medieval roots, but Charles took it to theatrical extremes. He revived the ancient belief that kings, appointed by God, could cure diseases with a simple caress, especially scrofula, a type of tuberculosis of the lymph nodes, charmingly referred to as the king's evil. Charles didn't just dabble in this nonsense. He leaned in. Over the course of his reign, it's estimated that he touched more than 100,000 people. That's not a typo. 100,000 ill citizens, brought to court or church, where Charles would lightly press his hand to their sores and then present them with a gold coin, called an angel, like a mystic fast food token. There are paintings of this, if you can stomach them, rows of the afflicted kneeling before the king, hoping for relief. Charles, robed and saintly, bestowing the healing touch like a messiah doing royal PR. And somehow, it worked, for his popularity at least. The public adored the ceremony. It made the king feel holy. It made the sick feel seen. It made everyone feel like maybe the chaos of the Civil War had finally passed. If your sovereign could cure illness with a pat on the neck, maybe the country was on the mend. The catch, of course, is that it didn't work. Not medically, not scientifically. But Charles wasn't interested in those details. He loved the drama of it all, the divine theater, the whispered awe, the idea that his flesh was literally blessed. He once insisted on continuing a touching ceremony despite being visibly ill himself, reportedly muttering, "God has chosen me. He'll not let me do harm." A statement that would be more impressive had he not been coughing halfway through it. This wasn't the only instance of Charles confusing personal charm with divine capacity. He filled his court with artists, playwrights, mistresses, and hangers-on. He adored attention. He famously said, "I am the last man in the world to give up my pleasures." And he wasn't wrong. His reign was one long hedonistic escape from the rigid morality of his Puritan predecessors. He reopened theaters, welcomed back dancing, and turned the royal court into something between a salon and a gossip column. But for all his easygoing charm, Charles was still deeply superstitious. He dabbled in astrology. He consulted alchemists. He kept strange relics and symbols around him, just in case. Even as science began to rise, this was the age of Newton, after all. Charles clung to the idea that kings were different. Not just politically, but physically. Their bodies were special, magical, immune to the rules that governed common men. It's a poetic image, a monarch striding through the halls of Whitehall, touching the sick with a hand that believed itself divine. But it's also a bleakly ironic one. Because while Charles was out healing others, he ignored his own failing health. He suffered strokes, fatigue, and a slew of undiagnosed ailments, none of which could be cured by the royal touch. He died in 1685, a man of faith and ceremony, surrounded by doctors who finally admitted the obvious. The king's evil wasn't scared of the king. Still, if Charles thought he could cure illness with a touch, the next royal on our list could barely navigate his own castle without supervision. In fact, he once got lost trying to walk home from a party, a royal mystery tour featuring one very confused aristocrat and several equally confused villagers. 10. Prince Albert Victor. Eddie. Prince Albert Victor, known to friends, enemies, and history as Eddie, was the kind of royal who could get lost in a straight hallway. He was the eldest son of the future King Edward VII, second in line to the throne, and widely regarded, then and now, as one of the dimmest candles ever placed on the royal candelabra. That may sound cruel, but even his own tutors gave up trying to light a fire where, by all accounts, there wasn't much oxygen. Eddie had one job: survive long enough to become king. And yet, at every turn, he gave the impression of a man baffled by door handles. Stories of his absent-mindedness were legendary. The most famous? He once left a lavish party at Windsor Castle and tried to walk home. Except instead of finding his royal chambers, he wandered off into the Berkshire countryside and had to ask local villagers for directions. They thought he was drunk. He wasn't. Just exceptionally Eddie. The scene writes itself. A confused, overdressed royal stumbling across fields, shoes muddied, crown metaphorically slipping, stopping at a cottage to politely inquire, "I say, is this the way to Windsor?" One might assume this sort of thing could happen once, maybe twice, to anyone. But with Eddie, it was more or less his default setting. His father, Edward VII, hoped that Eddie would eventually grow into the role of future king. Spoiler, he didn't. His education was a long string of tutors politely describing him as not academically inclined. That's royal speak for he thought Latin was a type of pudding. They tried sending him to university, Cambridge no less, but his professors quietly admitted that he had limited intellectual curiosity. His most consistent area of interest was polo. And yet, despite his alarming lack of competence, Eddie was attractive. Tall, fashionable, perfectly groomed, like someone had built a prince out of expensive wax. He was trotted out at public events to wave, smile, and avoid speaking in complete sentences. People saw what they wanted to see, a future monarch with poise and presence. Few noticed that behind the regal posture was a man who once confused Norway with Sweden and didn't seem entirely clear on which was which. Nowhere was this gap between appearance and substance more evident than in his brief, doomed engagement to Princess Mary of Teck. The match was announced with great fanfare. Portraits were painted, celebrations planned. But the couple's chemistry was as wooden as the furniture. Rumors swirled. Some said he didn't understand her jokes. Others said he didn't realize she was joking. The engagement fizzled after Eddie's untimely death, and Mary would later go on to marry his younger brother, the future George Thive. Talk about awkward family photos. Eddie died in 1892, at just 28 years old, from pneumonia during a flu epidemic. His passing shocked the nation and left a vacuum in the line of succession. Some mourned the lost prince. Others quietly sighed in relief. It's a grim footnote in royal history that the man once destined to wear the crown is now mostly remembered for losing his way home from a castle larger than most villages. And yet, for all his confusion and chronic fogginess, Eddie didn't try to rule anything. He never claimed divine healing powers or chased ancient witches. His legacy, if anything, is one of quiet, harmless incompetence, which is more than can be said for the next royal. Someone who treated taxpayer money like monopoly cash and burned through fortunes redecorating paradise. Cue the entrance of Princess Margaret, chain-smoking, gin-drinking, bathroom-renovating legend of royal excess. 11. Princess Margaret. Princess Margaret was the royal family's original headline generator. Long before tabloid drones hovered over Windsor rooftops, before tell-all interviews with Oprah, before younger royals trademarked their therapy sessions, there was Margaret, chain-smoking, sharp-tongued, and unapologetically committed to living like rules were for other people. If Queen Elizabeth II was the monarchy's anchor, Margaret was its fireworks display. Dazzling, volatile, and often positioned uncomfortably close to something flammable. Born in 1930 as the spare to her sister's heir, Margaret spent her early life basking in the warmth of royal favoritism. She was glamorous in the way British royals rarely managed to be, funny, stylish, perfectly pouty. If there were rules about what a young princess should do, Margaret took them as polite suggestions. She wasn't malicious, just devastatingly good at making extravagance look like personality. By the time she reached adulthood, she was the most eligible bachelorette in Britain. She smoked in public. She flirted at official events. She wore cocktail dresses as if she invented them. She was the embodiment of mid-century rebellion with a tiara. Impossibly posh and always just one martini away from saying exactly what she thought. But behind the velvet curtains of her public image was a lifestyle that could only be described as financially unhinged. Margaret didn't just enjoy luxury. She weaponized it. The centerpiece of her excess was her private villa on the Caribbean island of Mustique, a sun-drenched retreat she turned into the ultimate royal contradiction, a taxpayer-subsidized playground for socialites. She spent £60,000, in mid-20th century money, renovating it, including an infamous $6,000 bathroom, which featured hand-painted tiles, gold fixtures, and a tub large enough to legally qualify as a swimming pool. Royal aides called it her sanctuary. The press called it a national insult. Margaret, unsurprisingly, called it perfect. And it wasn't just the villa. Back in London, she tore through royal allowances redecorating her Kensington Palace apartments with the ferocity of someone on a home makeover show with no budget and no concept of restraint. Antique mirrors, silk wallpaper, custom chandeliers, each expense was filed under duty, a term she interpreted to mean creating a vibe. Her public role as a working royal was similarly patchy. Margaret attended functions when it suited her, gave speeches when it amused her, and generally treated protocol like a one-woman suggestion box. She was known to scold palace staff, ignore official schedules, and demand last-minute changes to public events because she didn't like the lighting. Once, she left an entire delegation of Commonwealth leaders waiting for her because her hairdresser was running late. When confronted, she reportedly responded with a shrug and a cigarette. Margaret's relationships, too, added fuel to the image. Her marriage to photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones started with a flurry of tabloid euphoria and descended into a fog of bitterness, affairs, and icy breakfast silences. They divorced in 1978, the first royal divorce in nearly a century, cementing her position as the monarchy's reigning icon of modern scandal. And through it all, Margaret never flinched. She kept showing up to public life with oversized sunglasses and perfectly calibrated disdain. To her credit, she never tried to hide it. Margaret made no apologies for her lifestyle, her attitude, or her taste in interior design. She once said, "I have never suffered from the disease of trying to be popular." Which is a beautiful sentiment, until you realize it cost the public millions. Still, for all her indulgence, Margaret never tried to dismantle the rules. She just danced circles around them in designer heels. That's more than can be said for her distant relative, Henry VIII, who didn't just ignore rules. He rewrote them, burned them, married them, and then had them rewritten again. One does not simply reform the church to get a divorce, unless one is Henry. 12. Henry VIII didn't just break the rules. He steamrolled them, rewrote them in Latin, and then framed the new version next to a portrait of himself looking smug in tights. If most royals bend reality slightly to accommodate their ego, Henry twisted it like a wet towel and wrung out 6 marriages, 2 church schisms, and 1 nation's collective sanity. He wasn't merely a king. He was an ongoing constitutional crisis in human form. Born in 1491, Henry wasn't even supposed to be king. That role was meant for his older brother Arthur, who conveniently died young, leaving Henry as the reluctant spare-turned-sudden heir. When he took the throne in 1509 at just 17, people expected a golden boy, tall, athletic, multilingual, musically gifted, even charming. And for a few brief years, he actually lived up to the hype. He threw lavish tournaments, studied theology, and wrote love songs. The problem? Henry was also allergic to anyone telling him no. At the core of his reign was an obsession with legacy, specifically producing a male heir to secure the Tudor line. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, failed to deliver a son who survived infancy. So Henry, after nearly 2 decades of marriage, decided he needed a new wife. That was awkward. Divorce wasn't exactly on the Catholic Church's menu, but Henry wasn't about to let theology get between him and a fresh start. So he did what any level-headed monarch would do. He declared that the Pope had no authority in England, created the Church of England, and made himself its supreme head. All so he could marry Anne Boleyn, who was clever, ambitious, and, unfortunately for her, not quite as fertile as Henry had hoped. When Anne too failed to produce a surviving son, Henry accused her of treason, had her tried in a rigged court, and executed her. The moral: if at first you don't succeed, try someone else. Then came Jane Seymour, who finally gave him his longed-for male heir, Edward. She died shortly after childbirth, which gave Henry an opportunity to mourn, by immediately planning his next marriage. His fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, was chosen based on a flattering portrait, which Henry later claimed was misleading. Upon meeting her in person, he reportedly recoiled and called her a Flanders mare. The marriage was annulled after 6 months. Anne got a pension. Henry got to pretend it had never happened. Wives 5 and 6 fared no better. Catherine Howard was young, lively, and imprudent. She was executed for alleged adultery. Catherine Parr survived by being educated, patient, and extremely good at pretending to agree with Henry's opinions about religion, marriage, and himself. But Henry's romantic chaos was only part of the story. He dissolved monasteries, seized church lands, and repurposed them as real estate giveaways for his favorites. He spent the church's money on wars, jewels, and palaces. He waged expensive, pointless campaigns in France and Scotland, mostly because he didn't like being left out when other kings were fighting. And through it all, his waistline grew. So did his list of enemies. By the end of his life, Henry weighed over 300 pounds and had to be moved with a mechanical contraption. His leg ulcers leaked, his moods darkened, and his court tiptoed around him like nervous cats in a thunderstorm. He died in 1547, having left behind a son, 2 daughters, and a religious identity crisis that would last centuries. To this day, Henry VIII is remembered less as a statesman and more as a cautionary tale. He didn't just bend the state to his will. He kneaded it like dough until it fit his appetite, literally and metaphorically. He is perhaps the only king whose most famous policy achievement was being done with his wife. And yet, for all his ego, Henry genuinely believed he was acting for the good of England. The next royal? She believed England was already perfect, especially when she was talking to a statue. Say hello to Queen Victoria, who spent her widowhood in deep conversation with her dead husband's marble likeness. 13. Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria ruled over the largest empire in human history, presided over an age of industrial miracles, and gave her name to an entire era. But for all the portraits of her looking stern in mourning black, the statues in every former colony, and the repressed national personality that followed in her wake, there's one detail that still stands out. After her husband died, she spoke to his statue, daily, often at length, and not politely. Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, died in 1861 of typhoid fever, and Victoria never recovered from the shock. Not emotionally, not spiritually, and, most visibly, not socially. She plunged into mourning and never came out. For the next 4 decades, she wore black, avoided public appearances, and referred to herself as the Widow of Windsor. But grief wasn't just an aesthetic. It became a household policy. And at the heart of it was Albert's statue. Positioned in her private quarters, this life-size likeness of Prince Albert became her sounding board, her emotional support marble, and, at times, her scolding target. Servants recorded her speaking to the statue as though it were a living presence. She'd greet it in the morning, she'd update it on affairs of state, she'd reprimand it when she was feeling abandoned. It wasn't uncommon for staff to overhear one-sided conversations like, "Albert, you would not have approved of this budget," or, "You left me with these ministers, and they are insufferable." Some assume this was a private quirk, an old woman's harmless eccentricity, but Victoria took it further. She kept Albert's clothes laid out each day, his shaving kit maintained, and his room preserved as if he might walk in at any moment and ask what had happened to the British Raj since breakfast. When traveling, she brought miniatures of the statue with her, like a Gothic version of a honeymoon memento. This wasn't grief. It was governance by seance. Victoria's obsession with Albert transformed her entire reign. Though she lived another 40 years after his death, she governed in his shadow. Cabinet ministers were required to consult Albert's old notes. Personal servants had to speak of him in the present tense. It was as though England was being ruled by a constitutional ghost and his emotionally exhausted wife. Public events were cancelled or scaled back. The Queen was rarely seen. Her subjects began referring to her as the invisible monarch. One satirical paper asked, "Does she rule by telegram?" And while her emotional spiral was understandable, Albert had been her closest advisor and arguably the only person she ever truly trusted. It also created a cultural climate of intense awkwardness. No one knew what to say. No one dared suggest she move on. Foreign dignitaries were often warned not to mention Albert unless they were prepared for a monologue about his moral perfection. One ambassador reportedly made the mistake of asking whether Victoria would consider remarrying. Her response? A 20-minute lecture on why no other man was sufficiently divine in character. Her family bore the brunt of it. Her children grew up competing with the statue for affection. Her son Edward, the future Edward VII, was treated like a living disappointment, a walking contrast to the sacred memory of his father. She once described him as frivolous, shallow, and not at all German enough. That last one stung, especially in an era where British identity was trying very hard to not be aggressively German. Still, despite her retreat from public life, Victoria maintained a strangled grip on power. She blocked reforms, vetoed ideas she disliked, and exercised political influence through letters written in a handwriting that grew more erratic by the year. All the while, the statue remained, unblinking, unmoved, and almost certainly tired of being talked at. By the time of her death in 1901, Queen Victoria had ruled for 63 years, built an empire, reshaped the monarchy, and made half the planet wear stiff collars. But to the people who lived in her palaces, she was something else entirely. A woman who turned a stone carving into a co-regent. Still, as eccentric as Victoria's grief may have been, the next royal didn't just worship a dead man. He made living soldiers march in the rain for fun while he sat in a carriage sipping brandy. Let's take a damp, disoriented march into the mind of Prince William, Duke of Cumberland. 14. Prince William, Duke of Cumberland. Prince William, Duke of Cumberland, was the kind of military leader who mistook cruelty for competence and logistics for a personal insult. Officially, he was the third and favorite son of King George II. Unofficially, he was the royal family's human embodiment of a stiff upper lip, a bad weather forecast, and the kind of management style that would later be outlawed in civilized armies. While his enemies called him the Butcher, his own soldiers had a more pressing complaint. The man simply would not stop marching them in the rain. Born in 1721, William was bred for war. Not metaphorically. His entire upbringing was a crash course in battlefield etiquette and monarchical micromanagement. He was handed a military commission as a teenager, and from then on, his personality appeared to fuse with that of a regimental drill sergeant who had never heard of empathy or dry socks. In his mind, war was not just a career, it was a lifestyle. Marching wasn't transportation, it was character development. The most infamous example of William's commitment to unnecessary suffering came during a series of drills on English soil. Training exercises, mind you, not wartime maneuvers. He insisted his troops perform endless regimental marches through thick mud and sideways rain, while he observed from the comfort of a covered carriage, sipping something expensive and giving feedback like a disapproving schoolmaster watching a group project fail. When officers protested that the men were soaked, freezing, and collapsing from exhaustion, William replied that hardship separates the weak from the worthwhile. Spoken like a man who never once had to wring out his own boots. This wasn't a one-off. William's obsession with discipline bordered on pathological. Soldiers were punished for the smallest infractions, including improperly shined buttons and irregular footfalls. He'd order drills to restart if a single man coughed during the maneuver. He was less a general and more a choreographer of military misery. But it wasn't just rain-soaked regiments that earned him his dark legacy. William's defining moment came during the Jacobite Rising of 1745, when he led government forces against the Scottish Highlanders, supporting Bonnie Prince Charlie. At the Battle of Culloden in 1746, still the last pitched battle fought on British soil, William's forces crushed the Jacobite army in less than an hour. The battle itself was brutal, but what followed was far worse. In the aftermath, William ordered the ruthless suppression of the Highlanders. Wounded rebels were denied medical aid, homes were burned, and entire villages punished for perceived disloyalty. The campaign earned him the nickname the Butcher of Culloden, a moniker he wore with less shame than one might expect. In his mind, he was maintaining order. To everyone else, he had just authored a cautionary tale in overreaction. Oddly enough, back home, William was hailed as a hero for a while. Medals were struck, portraits commissioned, and his father, George II, publicly praised him as "my brave boy." But public sentiment soured quickly. Stories of his excesses leaked. The military grew weary of his obsession with rigidity. Even his allies found his company exhausting. He demanded loyalty, but gave very little in return. And once the wars ended, William's usefulness declined like a stock chart in a recession. He spent his later years dabbling in politics, mostly in opposition to his nephew, the future George III. He had opinions on everything but insight into very little. His health failed, his influence faded, and he died in 1765, a man remembered less for victory and more for making entire battalions hate the concept of walking in formation. History tends to summarize him as a cautionary figure, someone who mistook authority for genius, cruelty for strength, and military efficiency for moral clarity. And in a way, that legacy fits. Prince William, Duke of Cumberland, didn't just march his troops through mud, he dragged the idea of noble warfare through it too. Still, as obsessed as he was with order, at least he didn't outsource his entire military command to a mistress. That particular innovation in poor judgment belongs to our next royal, Prince Frederick, Duke of York, a man whose biggest tactical failure was trusting his love life with the national army. 15. Prince Frederick, Duke of York. Prince Frederick, Duke of York, didn't invent the phrase nepotism with extra steps, but he certainly lived by it. As the second son of King George III, he was handed a military career like a birthday gift nobody could return. And though he was famously immortalized in the nursery rhyme, "The Grand Old Duke of York," he had 10,000 men. The part they left out was that he also had one mistress, several scandals, and a remarkable talent for turning romantic decisions into military disasters. Born in 1763, Frederick was the classic royal spare, not quite in line for the throne, but too important to ignore. So naturally, he was fast-tracked into a military career, given a title, a fancy uniform, and command over thousands of troops long before he could grow a proper mustache. In fairness, Frederick wasn't as catastrophically incompetent as some of his royal peers. He had some aptitude for organization and was instrumental in later reforming the army's administration. But for every well-written memo, there was an equal and opposite blunder, usually involving his personal life. Enter Mary Ann Clark. Mary Ann was a former actress and a woman of considerable charm, wit, and ambition. She became Frederick's mistress around 1803 and quickly moved into a well-upholstered life funded by the Duke himself. But Clark was not content with being merely decorative. She saw opportunity, and she took it. The arrangement was straightforward. She had access to Frederick, and officers in the British Army had access to her. In exchange for generous gifts, Clark allegedly promised to use her influence to secure commissions, promotions, and other military perks. The going rate for an officer's commission, whispered through London drawing rooms, became a matter of how well one could flirt with Mary Ann. Frederick, naturally, denied knowing anything about it. Unfortunately, Parliament disagreed. In 1809, the scandal exploded into public view when Clark was called to testify before a House of Commons investigation. It was like the Regency version of a tabloid tell-all. She confirmed that she'd taken money in exchange for military favors, and that the Duke had full knowledge of her entrepreneurial activities. She even offered to provide letters from Frederick himself. The public was scandalized. The army was embarrassed. The king was furious. In a half-hearted attempt at damage control, Frederick resigned as commander-in-chief. It was meant to be a dignified exit, but it felt more like a slow shuffle off stage. For a time, he was relegated to the sidelines while the press had a field day with caricatures of Clark as the real commander of British forces. Satirical prints showed her handing out swords while Frederick watched helplessly from the background, a man thoroughly outmaneuvered in his own war office. Ironically, the scandal did little lasting damage to his reputation in the long run. After a few years of carefully timed silence, Frederick returned to his post as commander-in-chief and helped implement several key military reforms. He standardized training, improved logistics, and pushed for merit-based promotions, likely a reaction to the very system he had accidentally corrupted. His reforms would later lay the groundwork for a more professional British Army, proving that even scandal can be followed by service, provided you survive the headlines. Still, Frederick's legacy remains tangled in contradiction. He was a decent administrator and a terrible judge of character. A man capable of reforming an entire military system while being entirely unaware, or unwilling to admit, that his girlfriend was selling pieces of it out the back door. In many ways, he represents the core paradox of royal idiocy. the ability to wield immense institutional power while having no discernible grip on basic personal responsibility. And yet, for all his blunders, Frederick still managed to avoid the kind of literal disasters that plagued one of his royal predecessors. Because if he outsourced the army to a mistress, the next royal managed to lose the actual crown jewels. Not in a metaphorical sense, but physically, in a swamp. That royal genius? None other than King John, also known as Lackland. 16. King John, Lackland. King John of England is remembered less as a monarch and more as a medieval punchline. He was the kind of king who managed to offend the barons, the church, the French, the Welsh, the Scots, and probably his own reflection. He's the only English king to ever earn the nickname Lackland, which sounds poetic until you realize it was basically medieval slang for, "This guy can't keep anything." And in perhaps the most on-brand move of any royal in British history, he once lost the crown jewels in a swamp. Let's set the scene. It's October 1216. King John is not having a good year, or decade, or reign. England is in chaos. The barons have rebelled, again, thanks to his endless taxation, erratic leadership, and general personality defects. The French have invaded. The Pope has excommunicated him. His own nobles have forced him to sign the Magna Carta, and he's already trying to wriggle out of it. At this point, John isn't so much ruling a kingdom as misplacing one in real time. Desperate to regroup, he flees from hostile territory in East Anglia and makes a dash across the Wash, an estuary in eastern England known for its deadly tides, treacherous mudflats, and general disdain for careless monarchs. John, traveling with his entire royal baggage train, decides to split his party. He takes a quicker land route while sending the slower wagons, laden with his treasure, his documents, and yes, his crown jewels, across the Wash. It was, in every conceivable way, a disaster waiting to happen. The Wash is notorious for its rapidly rising tides, shifting sands, and the kind of terrain that makes cartographers sigh dramatically. The royal convoy attempted to cross at low tide, hoping to beat the water, but they misjudged the timing, badly. The tide swept in faster than expected. Horses panicked, wagons flipped, men drowned, and somewhere beneath the rising salt water and sucking mud, the crown jewels of England vanished. Gone. Swallowed by the sea like a metaphor so on the nose it practically winks at the audience. There was no recovery mission, no dramatic rescue effort. The royal treasure was simply lost. Perhaps it still lies there, buried beneath centuries of silt and folklore, waiting for some bewildered metal detectorist to stumble onto a king's humiliation. Now, you might think this would be the low point of John's reign. But remarkably, it was just another entry in a long series of spectacular failures. Before he misplaced his monarchy in a puddle, John had already alienated most of his court, hiked taxes to fund disastrous military campaigns, and managed to lose Normandy, yes, all of Normandy, to the French crown. Hence, Lackland. He had a talent for betrayal that would make Shakespeare's villains blush. He turned on allies, executed rivals without trial, and once starved the wife and son of a rebellious noble to death as a warning to others. His paranoia was legendary. He traveled constantly, fearing plots. Royal scribes complained of his habit of changing location mid-sentence, which led to awkward legal documents with multiple cities listed in a single paragraph. Even his death was anticlimactic. After contracting dysentery on campaign, still running from his own mess, he died in the night at Newark Castle. According to some accounts, he asked to be buried with the few treasures he still had left, which probably amounted to a rusty sword, an IOU to the Pope, and a lingering sense of deep embarrassment. King John's reign is so universally mocked that even the official royal family has more or less disowned him. He doesn't get statues. He barely gets portraits. In most history books, he's the footnote who signed Magna Carta under duress, the villain of every Robin Hood retelling, and the man who quite literally lost the crown. And yet, for all of John's catastrophic ineptitude, At least he didn't dress up his horse in gold jewelry just because he felt it looked a bit plain. That particular act of regal fashion madness belongs to our next royal, Richard II, the king who thought his steed deserved better accessories. 17. Richard II. Richard II was a king who would have thrived on Instagram. Not because he was a great ruler or a brilliant strategist. He wasn't. But because he knew the value of a good aesthetic. The man had a brand, and he stuck to it like gold leaf to parchment. While England suffered from political unrest, economic downturns, and the lingering aftershocks of the Black Death, Richard was busy ordering custom-designed robes for his horse. And no, that's not a metaphor. He literally had golden outfits made for his horse because he thought it looked too plain. This was a man deeply committed to the performance of power. Born in 1367 and crowned at the age of 10, Richard came into his throne as a child monarch, a position that demands maturity and delegation. Instead, he developed a lifelong obsession with grandeur, image, and personal divinity. Richard didn't want to rule as a king. He wanted to appear as a god on earth, preferably one with an entourage and silk-lined boots. Early on, people gave him the benefit of the doubt. He'd survived the peasants' revolt in 1381 by riding out to meet the angry mob himself, an act of bravery that, for a brief moment, made people think he had potential. But that optimism aged poorly. As Richard grew older, he drifted from practical governance into what can only be described as aesthetic despotism. He demanded absolute loyalty, yes, but he also demanded that the loyalty be expressed in finely woven tapestries. The royal wardrobe ballooned. Richard spent vast sums of money, much of it borrowed, on fabrics, embroidery, rare dyes, elaborate feasts, and architectural projects that served no purpose other than making him feel impressive. He reimagined the royal court as a stage production where he was the eternal lead actor and everyone else was hired help. And if you didn't applaud loudly enough, you were exiled. Among his more extravagant expenditures was his obsession with matching garments, not just for himself, but for his entire retinue. Servants were dressed in coordinated livery. Courtiers were expected to wear certain colors depending on the season. His personal garments were so heavily jeweled they sometimes had to be carried behind him. And his horses? Oh yes, the royal stables became a couture project. One surviving account claims he commissioned a full set of golden barding, ornamental armor, for his favorite steed, including enameled trimmings and velvet reins, a walking chandelier on hooves. But this wasn't just indulgent fashion. Richard believed in the divine right of kings in the most literal sense. He didn't just act like a chosen ruler. He believed he was placed above everyone else by God himself, and that any resistance to his authority was blasphemy. This belief bled into every area of his rule. He surrounded himself with flatterers, purged advisors who questioned him, and tried to legally insulate the monarchy from any form of criticism. Naturally, this went over like a lead tiara with the nobility. His heavy-handed approach to authority, combined with his financial recklessness, led to mounting resistance. Parliament pushed back. Nobles began to whisper. And in a moment that historians still marvel at for its sheer pettiness, Richard had several of his critics arrested, executed, or sent into permanent exile, all while continuing to fund his wardrobe habits at full throttle. By the 1390s, things began to unravel. Richard, feeling threatened by the growing power of his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, the future Henry IV, had him banished and stripped of inheritance rights. This was a spectacular miscalculation. Bolingbroke returned in 1399 with an army, seized the throne with surprising ease, and had Richard imprisoned. No dramatic final battle, no poetic downfall, just a man who spent most of his adult life arranging flowers on the table, being quietly escorted from power. Richard died the following year under mysterious circumstances in Pontefract Castle, probably murdered, though official records remain vague. His legacy is one of tragic vanity, a monarch so obsessed with the idea of kingship that he forgot to actually rule. He turned his reign into a fashion show, his crown into a prop, and his kingdom into a stage. And yet, for all his golden horses and divine delusions, Richard II never mistook a tree for a foreign diplomat. That unique distinction belongs to his far more famously troubled successor, George III, the monarch who once attempted to have a conversation with an oak tree, believing it was the King of Prussia. 18. George III. George III is best known to many as the Mad King who lost America, which is a bit like describing the Titanic as the boat with the nice staircase. Technically true, but woefully incomplete. Because while it's true that George oversaw the American colonies' breakaway in 1776, and yes, he did suffer from a series of devastating mental health crises, the full picture of George III is a far stranger, sadder, and sometimes downright baffling royal portrait. One that at one point involved him talking to an oak tree, believing it to be the King of Prussia. Born in 1738 and ascending the throne in 1760, George III ruled for longer than any of his predecessors, an impressive feat, though much of the latter half of his reign was spent in a fog of confusion, isolation, and increasingly surreal episodes that felt more like Shakespearean tragedy than stately governance. In his early years, George was earnest, bookish, and determined to be a moral king, unlike his hedonistic grandfather, George II, or his debauched father, Frederick, Prince of Wales. George III didn't drink to excess, didn't gamble outrageously, and didn't fill the court with mistresses. In fact, he married Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz and remained, by all historical accounts, faithfully devoted. So far, so good. He even took an active interest in farming, earning him the nickname Farmer George, which was meant as an insult, but now sounds like the setup for a BBC miniseries. But behind the well-meaning exterior was a man whose mind would eventually become his undoing. Beginning in the 1780s, George started to exhibit erratic behavior. At first, it was easy to dismiss. Rambling speeches, nervous energy, long conversations with himself. But as time went on, things escalated. He spoke for hours without pause, often jumping between subjects with no logic or connection. He would repeat phrases over and over. He experienced severe insomnia, racing thoughts, and periods of manic elation followed by crushing melancholy. And then came the infamous tree. One day, during one of his most severe episodes, George III was observed walking slowly through the gardens of Kew Palace, deep in conversation with an oak tree. He believed the tree was Frederick William III, the King of Prussia, an actual living monarch and one of Britain's continental allies. Witnesses said he gestured politely, bowed slightly, and launched into what appeared to be a diplomatic discussion. One can only imagine the awkwardness of the courtiers watching this moment unfold. Does one interrupt a royal negotiation with a tree? Offer the bark refreshments? As bizarre as it was, this moment became symbolic of George's unraveling mind. It was no longer eccentricity. It was illness. And it would define the rest of his reign. The medical consensus today is that George suffered from acute porphyria, a rare genetic disorder that can cause symptoms ranging from abdominal pain to hallucinations. Some have suggested bipolar disorder. Others argue for a combination of both. But whatever the cause, the result was the same. By the early 1800s, George III could no longer effectively rule. In 1811, after years of worsening episodes and failed treatments, including bloodletting, leeches, and cold water baths that probably didn't help anyone, Parliament passed the Regency Act. His son, the future George IV, was appointed Prince Regent. George III lived another 9 years, blind, mostly deaf, and largely unaware of the world around him. His days were spent alone at Windsor Castle, surrounded by caretakers and fading portraits of a past he could no longer grasp. It's easy to laugh at the image of a king chatting with a tree. And many have. Satirists of the time took great delight in mocking the monarch's mental decline. But beneath the jokes lies something undeniably tragic. A man who tried to be better than the kings before him, only to be betrayed by his own body and mind. He ended his reign as a shadow of himself, unaware, largely forgotten by the public, yet still wearing the title of king. A crown without consciousness, a monarch in name only, and yet, for all the tragedy and confusion of George III, he never tried to legislate women's fashion to preserve their feminine mystery. That odd little crusade fell to a far less consequential royal, Prince Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, a man who believed bloomers were a moral threat. 19. Prince Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland. If George III's madness was tragic, Prince Ernest Augustus's mind was something else entirely. Suspicious, controlling, and absolutely certain that women's bloomers were the beginning of civilizational collapse. The fifth son of George III, Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, managed to combine the worst traits of 19th-century authoritarianism with a weird, persistent concern for how women dressed. It wasn't that he simply disapproved of fashion trends, most elderly royals do. It's that he actually tried to ban bloomers on the grounds that they would destroy the mystery of femininity. That's a real quote, from a man who once insisted that modesty could only be maintained if fabric didn't move too freely near a lady's ankle. But let's back up. Born in 1771, Ernest was always something of a problem child in the royal nursery, less charming than his older brothers, more aggressive than the younger ones, and obsessed with discipline from an early age. He trained as a soldier and showed some genuine skill, at least in the logistical sense. But where most people outgrow petty authoritarianism, Ernest built his personality around it. He had strong opinions about everything, particularly when it came to religion, monarchy, and his own alleged moral superiority. When he wasn't fighting on the battlefield, he was picking fights in Parliament. He opposed Catholic emancipation. He opposed liberal reforms. He opposed basically anything that looked or smelled like progress. Even his fellow royals thought he was difficult. His letters are filled with sharp-tongued rants, not just about political threats, but about society's decaying morals, including the horrifying prospect of women riding bicycles. This brings us to his vendetta against bloomers. The bloomer, for the uninitiated, was a mid-19th century garment that allowed women more comfort and mobility than the traditional hoop skirt. They were inspired by early suffragists and reformers, who believed women shouldn't have to risk physical injury just to walk to the post office. To most people, bloomers were a symbol of modernity, health, and maybe even empowerment. To Ernest, they were heresy with a waistband. He publicly warned that bloomers would make women brazen and undignified. He claimed they would erode the mystery of femininity, by which he apparently meant the ability of women to walk silently and unbothered while drowning in 30 pounds of taffeta. He believed that modesty required physical restriction. Anything that allowed ease, motion, or practicality was, in his eyes, a slippery slope to anarchy. The absurdity of this view was not lost on his contemporaries. Even within his own family, Ernest's obsession with propriety was seen as outdated, if not downright delusional. And yet, his influence was significant. He wasn't just a crank with a title. In 1837, he became King of Hanover, thanks to the quirks of succession law that split the British and Hanoverian crowns. Queen Victoria couldn't inherit Hanover due to Salic law. And so, Ernest got his own little kingdom to micromanage, complete with actual power. He ruled Hanover with the same iron glove he applied to his opinions on undergarments, resisting reform, banning liberal newspapers, and strengthening the police state. He was suspicious of democracy, deeply conservative and not particularly popular, but he was relentless. Every year he sent long-winded letters to his relatives in England, warning them of the moral decay that would come from innovation. Railroads were dangerous. Novels were corrupting. Women in trousers? Apocalypse. In private life, he was no easier. Rumors of scandal followed him throughout his career, feuds with other nobles, tense family relations, and a personal stiffness that bordered on robotic. One diplomat described him as a man who never smiles except at his own outrage. Ernest died in 1851, still clinging to his belief that society was spiraling out of control and that he, a forgotten German king with an English accent, had been the last sane man to try and stop it. History has not been kind, nor has it been particularly interested. But in his crusade against bloomers, Ernest left us with a kind of inverted parable. When power meets insecurity, even trousers become a threat. And yet, for all his paranoia about women's clothing, the next royal on our list had a different kind of relationship with recklessness. Because where Ernest feared change, Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, decided to pilot an aircraft without a license, and learned the hard way that aviation is not something you improvise. 20. Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester. Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, is one of those royals who lived in the shadow of bigger names, better scandals, and far flashier titles. But he made sure to leave behind at least one moment of breathtaking idiocy that still makes military historians wince. Specifically, the time he attempted to pilot a military aircraft without a license, without training, and, somehow even more impressively, without telling anyone. Spoiler, he crashed it into a field. Born in 1900 as the third son of King George V, Prince Henry had all the pedigree but none of the pressure. He wasn't destined for the crown, which meant he could be molded into something more practical. His family decided he would be a soldier, a dutiful, discreet royal who would march in step, cut a clean figure in uniform, and never embarrass the monarchy. For a while, that mostly worked. Henry joined the army, rose through the ranks, and developed a reputation as the quiet one among the royal brothers. But being the quiet one doesn't necessarily mean being the responsible one. Prince Henry had a strong interest in aviation, perfectly respectable in the 1920s and 30s, when aircraft were still symbols of modernity and masculine adventure. His brothers, Edward, later Edward VIII, and Albert, later George VI, had their own glamorous public roles, so flying gave Henry something unique to do. Something bold. Dashing even. But instead of going through the usual channels, like completing flight school, logging training hours, or asking someone with experience, Henry apparently decided to just wing it. One day, in what can only be described as an overconfident royal impulse, Henry climbed into an aircraft parked at a military base, took off without authorization, and attempted to fly it solo. He hadn't been fully trained, he didn't have a pilot's license, and most crucially, he had not informed a single person that he intended to perform a feat that required specialized knowledge, hand-eye coordination, and a working understanding of physics. Details are fuzzy, likely because the British military and royal family were highly motivated to keep them that way. But what is known is this. Prince Henry took off, lost control, and crash-landed in a field, damaging the aircraft and astonishing the soldiers who came running to find out who had just dropped a plane out of the sky like a clumsy seagull. He survived, of course. Royals usually do, and the incident was hushed up with the kind of polite silence that only aristocratic institutions can manage. No court-martial, no public explanation. The official record reads like someone spilled tea on the page and decided not to retype it. But among those in the know, military officers, palace insiders, a few horrified airmen, the story became part of the quiet folklore of royal overreach. A tale of privilege overriding protocol. A reminder that even crash landings can be papered over provided your surname is Windsor. To his credit, Henry did eventually take flight lessons. He went on to earn a legitimate pilot's license, though his instructors likely watched him like hawks. His later military career was uneventful, filled with ceremonial duties and the kind of tidy assignments designed to keep royals visible but out of harm's way. He married, had children, and became Governor-General of Australia in 1945, a position where he was generally respected, even if the locals never quite figured out what he did. But the image lingers. Prince Henry, in a pressed uniform, hair neatly parted, climbing into a machine he didn't know how to operate, convinced that titles and curiosity would lift him safely off the ground. It's the distilled spirit of royal folly. The belief that consequences are optional and preparation is something other people do. And yet, at least Henry's crash was mostly private. The next royal scandal we visit wasn't just public. It was door-banging, spectacle-level public. Because Queen Caroline of Brunswick, estranged wife of George IV, once showed up uninvited to her own husband's coronation, hammered on the doors of Westminster Abbey, and demanded to be let in, like a royal ghost refusing to be exorcised. 21. Queen Caroline of Brunswick. If the British monarchy ever dabbled in reality television, Queen Caroline of Brunswick would have been its breakout star. Loud, theatrical, impossible to ignore, and perpetually in the wrong place at the wrong time, usually on purpose, Caroline turned royal dysfunction into live performance. And nowhere was that more perfectly staged than at her estranged husband's coronation, when she arrived uninvited, in full regalia, and demanded to be let in like the ghost of scandals past. Born in 1768, Caroline was a German princess married off to the future George IV, back when he was still the Prince of Wales. The marriage was doomed from day one. George despised her almost immediately. Reportedly drunk at the altar, he found her loud, awkward, and insufficiently fashionable. Caroline, in turn, found him pompous, unpleasant, and grotesquely self-absorbed. They spent just long enough together to produce a single child, Princess Charlotte, before retreating into mutual loathing. George tried to buy her off. He gave her a generous allowance on the condition that she live abroad and stay out of sight. Caroline took the deal and promptly began parading around Europe with a colorful entourage, developing a reputation for eccentricity and flamboyance that did nothing to help her already battered image in London. She attended masked balls. She hosted lavish dinners. She reportedly danced barefoot in Naples. For years she was more rumor than person, a tabloid headline in human form. Then, in 1820, George III died, and her estranged husband became King George IV. That should have been the end of Caroline's story, a faded royal footnote. But Caroline, ever the disruptor, had other ideas. She returned to England uninvited, claiming her rightful place as queen consort, and demanding full recognition from a nation still unsure whether to be appalled or entertained. George IV, now in full theatrical mode himself, refused to acknowledge her. He launched a full-blown legal campaign to strip her of her title and dignity. The government, dragged reluctantly into the drama, prepared a bill in Parliament, the Pains and Penalties Bill, which would annul the marriage and remove her from the royal register. The public, never once to pass up a messy divorce involving a monarch and a woman with flair, immediately took Caroline's side. She became a symbol, albeit a chaotic one, of populist resistance against a deeply unpopular king. Crowds greeted her carriage with cheers. Pamphlets mocked George IV's extravagance and painted Caroline as the wronged wife of the century. The trial became a national spectacle, complete with salacious testimony, political backstabbing, and the general air of a circus without the structure. And then came Coronation Day, July 19th, 1821. George IV planned the event like a royal redemption arc. Majestic processions, golden robes, a literal banquet for the ages. It cost over $250,000, an astronomical sum at the time, enough to build hospitals, repair roads, or in George's case, overdecorate a really large chair. But Caroline wasn't in the script. She had been officially banned from attending. The doors of Westminster Abbey were closed to her. So she did what any sensible uninvited queen would do. She showed up anyway, dressed in ceremonial black, riding in a carriage, and walked straight to the main entrance of the Abbey. With the nation watching, She banged on the door, repeatedly, loudly. She demanded to be let in. Guards blocked her path. Courtiers refused to make eye contact. Bishops stared at their shoes. Somewhere inside, George IV pretended not to hear the echo of his political nightmare knocking outside. She was turned away. So she tried the next door, and the next. Each time, denied. The woman who was, by law and by marriage, the Queen of the United Kingdom, stood outside the church where her own husband was being crowned, locked out like a disgraced guest who'd brought drama to a royal wedding. The symbolism was brutal. The monarchy, built on image, tradition, and polished denial, had physically closed its doors on the one person who refused to play along. Caroline, embarrassed but defiant, returned to her lodgings. She died less than a month later, at the age of 53. Her last request? To have the words, "The injured Queen of England," inscribed on her coffin. Say what you will about Caroline of Brunswick, she didn't go quietly, and she certainly didn't go unseen. Still, if Caroline tried to storm a coronation, the next royal on our list went the other direction entirely, into battle, armed with a sword in one hand and a poodle in the other. Because Prince Rupert of the Rhine truly believed his dog was magically bulletproof. 22. Prince Rupert of the Rhine. Prince Rupert of the Rhine was many things. Soldier, scientist, artist, inventor, occasional pirate, and yet what he's most remembered for is taking a poodle into battle because he thought the dog was magically bulletproof. It sounds like the setup to a farce, but no, it actually happened. For a brief shining moment in the 17th century, England's most dashing cavalier was accompanied on the battlefield by a white standard poodle named Boy, whom he believed to be a supernatural familiar that could turn the tide of war. Let's rewind. Rupert was born in 1619, the nephew of King Charles I, and grew up surrounded by warfare, exile, and enough family dysfunction to make the Tudors look like the Brady Bunch. He was tall, handsome, charming, and unnervingly sure of himself. The kind of man who could walk into a duel, deliver a Latin quote, and somehow make both sides cheer. When the English Civil War broke out in 1642, pitting royalists, supporters of Charles I, against parliamentarians, Rupert became the glittering poster boy of the king's army. He was young, fearless, and flashy, the perfect royal mascot for a cause that needed all the glamour it could get. The Cavaliers adored him. The Roundheads, the parliamentarian side, loathed him, and everyone agreed that Rupert was dangerously good at turning warfare into performance art. He led cavalry charges like stage plays, dramatic, impulsive, and often effective, until he inevitably decided to chase the enemy too far and leave his flanks wide open. But even Rupert's theatrical heroics couldn't compete with his most eccentric military accessory, his beloved poodle. Boy was no ordinary dog. According to legend, Rupert acquired him during his early campaigns and quickly became convinced the creature was charmed. The dog followed him everywhere, into camps, councils, and even the front lines. Soldiers whispered that Boy could catch bullets in his teeth. Others swore the animal was immune to swords, cannons, and presumably common sense. Rupert didn't exactly discourage the myth. Roundhead propaganda had a field day. Pamphlets circulated accusing Rupert of witchcraft, claiming Boy was a demonic familiar that could transform into a man, spy on parliamentarian troops, and conjure storms. One publication described the dog as a Lapland sprite in the shape of a white dog, whose master doth converse with devils. Another pamphlet warned that the beast could make royalist soldiers invisible. Rupert, for his part, seemed to find the hysteria hilarious. He brought Boy everywhere, often letting him run beside him during cavalry charges. The image of a royal prince galloping across muddy fields with a pristine white poodle at his heels must have been both absurd and terrifying to his enemies, a living meme of war propaganda centuries before the printing press could do it justice. Unfortunately, like most good legends, Boy's story ended abruptly and a little pathetically. During the Battle of Marston Moor in 1644, one of the Civil War's decisive engagements, Boy was reportedly shot and killed. The parliamentarian army, convinced they had slain the devil's familiar, allegedly celebrated the event with disturbing enthusiasm. Rupert, according to some accounts, was genuinely distraught. He buried the dog with military honors and refused to let anyone mock the loss. The myth of Boy outlived him. Pamphlets later circulated claiming the dog had been resurrected or that Rupert had replaced him with a ghostly twin. Rupert himself fared better than his canine companion, at least for a while. After the royalist cause collapsed and Charles I lost both crown and head, Rupert fled abroad. He became a mercenary, then a naval officer, then, because apparently he was incapable of sitting still, a scientist and amateur inventor. He helped found the Royal Society, experimented with metallurgy, and even developed Prince Rupert's drops, a curious glass invention that fascinated early physicists. He fought in the Second Anglo-Dutch War, explored trade routes, and dabbled in colonial ventures. And yet, through all of that, his legend was forever tied to the white poodle that trotted beside him through gunfire. It didn't matter that he became a respected admiral or a pioneering chemist. History remembered the dog, because nothing better captures the spirit of royal absurdity than a prince convinced that supernatural pet ownership counts as military strategy. Rupert died in 1682, having outlived most of his family and his reputation as a reckless cavalier. But his story survives in that perfect blend of arrogance and eccentricity that defines so many royals before and after him. A man who believed in divine destiny, personal luck, and the unbreakable loyalty of a dog that was definitely, absolutely not magic. Still, if Rupert's delusion was adorably misguided, the next royals was catastrophic. Because where Rupert trusted a poodle to protect him from bullets, Charles I trusted divine right to protect him from politics, and ended up learning that a crown is only sacred until someone sharpens an axe. 23. Charles I. Charles I is what happens when you mix divine entitlement with social ineptitude and then give it a kingdom. He was the kind of monarch who didn't just believe in the divine right of kings. He thought it came with an automatic immunity to consequences, compromise, and occasionally reality. While his father, James I, dabbled in awkward superstition and overwrought sermons, Charles took a more minimalist approach. He preferred not to explain himself at all. This was not a helpful trait. Born in 1600, Charles became king in 1625 and almost immediately began acting like England had been handed to him as a personal gift from heaven, wrapped in velvet and bound in prayer. He spoke softly, dressed impeccably, and was deeply devout. He also had the political instincts of a decorative candlestick. He believed monarchy was not a public office, but a sacred calling, and that Parliament, if it had to exist at all, was a kind of seasonal irritation he could ignore at will. The trouble was, Parliament didn't see it that way, and neither did the rest of the country. Charles had a number of notable flaws, but his most persistent one was an unwavering belief in his own fashion sense. He didn't trust commoners, didn't really understand Protestants, despite being one, and didn't like being told what to do. He married Henrietta Maria, a Catholic French princess, which raised eyebrows in a country still twitchy about popery. Then, he raised taxes without parliamentary approval, refused to call Parliament for years at a time, and surrounded himself with advisors who shared his belief that compromise was for people without crowns. And then came his obsession with tailoring. You see, Charles wasn't just vain. He was spiritually vain. He believed that a king's appearance was part of his divine identity. Every stitch, every embroidery pattern, every feathered hat wasn't mere decoration. It was royal theology in motion. He once declared that only his personal tailor could make garments worthy of the king's image. He wore elaborate lace collars so wide they could have doubled as satellite dishes. His favorite outfits were not just silk, but embroidered with pearls, gold thread, and symbols of his sacred kingship. He looked less like a leader of a fractious nation and more like a very expensive chandelier that had developed opinions on church governance. In one infamous incident, Charles delayed a public appearance by nearly 2 hours because he felt the hue of his crimson robe was off by several degrees. When an advisor suggested no one would notice, Charles reportedly said, "But heaven would." You can't buy that level of delusion. You have to inherit it. The deeper problem, of course, was that Charles thought image was leadership. He believed that presenting himself as a holy figure was enough to command obedience. So when Parliament began pushing back, asking for more oversight, less arbitrary taxation, and, occasionally, basic respect, Charles responded by doubling down on ceremony and isolation. He literally walked away from the negotiating table and into civil war. What followed was the English Civil War. Cavaliers, royalists, versus Roundheads, parliamentarians, swords and pikes and pamphlets, all swirling around a king who thought the whole thing was just a temporary unpleasantness that could be solved with better posture and divine patience. Spoiler, it couldn't. After years of bloodshed, Charles lost the war. Captured, imprisoned, and eventually tried for treason, he refused to recognize the legitimacy of the court. When asked to defend himself, he gave long, rambling monologues about kingship and God, as though England was just one big stage for his closing performance. In 1649, Charles was executed, a king, decapitated by his own subjects. And in that final moment, dressed in black, perfectly composed, still obsessed with how he appeared to history, he declared, "A subject may not lawfully take up arms against his king, and I am the King of England." Right up until he wasn't. To this day, Charles III remains one of the most tragically tone-deaf rulers in British history. Not because he was cruel. He wasn't, particularly. Not because he was stupid. He could be clever when it didn't involve people. But because he mistook ritual for authority, aesthetics for legitimacy, and divine right for a standing ovation. Still, even Charles never spent his afternoons building sandcastles at a fortress. That peculiar royal pastime belongs to his far more eccentric descendant, Edward II, the king who turned Kenilworth Castle into a giant playpen and ruled with the attention span of a distracted toddler. 24. Edward II. If kingship were a sandbox, Edward II would have been its most enthusiastic resident. Not because he had a childlike innocence, though there was plenty of that, but because he seemed genuinely more interested in playing king than actually being one. While his barons plotted and his enemies advanced, Edward spent his afternoons building whimsical projects like the infamous Royal Sandcastle Wall at Kenilworth Castle, as if England could be governed with buckets and imagination. Born in 1284, Edward II was the fourth son of Edward I but became heir after the deaths of his older brothers. His father, Edward I, known as the Hammer of the Scots, was a hardened, battle-worn monarch who spent his reign subduing rebellions, enforcing royal authority, and expanding English territory through sheer brute force. His son, by contrast, would rather have been tending his hobbies. And his hobbies were strange. To say Edward II was unsuited for kingship is like saying a jellyfish is unfit to drive a carriage. He wasn't stupid exactly, but he was persistently uninterested in the job he inherited. He preferred physical labor to politics, famously enjoyed ditch digging with peasants, and would often sneak out of royal duties to thatch roofs, build walls, or attend random village celebrations where he could dance and drink without having to sign anything. He reportedly loved swimming, crafting, and informal games. His barons were less amused. One noble described him as a man more fitted to serve than to govern. The most absurd example of Edward's misplaced priorities? That would be the time he commissioned a giant wall made of sand at Kenilworth Castle, reportedly just to see if it could be done. This was not a symbolic architectural metaphor. It was, according to chroniclers, an actual structure, a whimsical, crumbling barrier of earth and water, constructed by royal command for no military or strategic purpose whatsoever. No one quite knew what to do with it. Some thought it might be part of a larger landscaping project. Others assumed it was a joke. It wasn't. the sand wall became a kind of surreal monument to his reign, impractical, temporary, and completely detached from the realities of statecraft. Meanwhile, his actual governance was collapsing faster than the shoreline. Edward's court became infamous for favoritism, particularly his extravagant affection for a young man named Piers Gaveston, whom he elevated far above his station. Gaveston was arrogant, flamboyant, and widely loathed by the nobility, not least because Edward gave him titles, lands, and authority far beyond what anyone, least of all Gaveston, was equipped to handle. The king's blind devotion to him was a political hand grenade. The barons rebelled, again and again. Even after Gaveston was executed by angry nobles in 1312, Edward doubled down on his habit of choosing ill-suited favorites. He later promoted another pair of brothers, Hugh, Despenser the Elder and Younger, to positions of immense influence. They were, if anything, even more ruthless and unpopular than Gaveston, and their presence only deepened the chasm between Edward and his increasingly enraged nobility. By 1326, his queen, Isabella of France, tired of being ignored, insulted, and politically marginalized, returned to England with an invading army. She was accompanied by her ally and possible lover, Roger Mortimer, and they swept through the country with barely any resistance. Edward, oblivious until the very end, fled the capital with the Despensers and wandered aimlessly while the monarchy effectively collapsed behind him. He was eventually captured, forced to abdicate in favor of his son, Edward III, and imprisoned under harsh conditions. His favorites were executed, his dignity stripped, and his final years were spent in quiet disgrace. A man who once played at kingship now reduced to a shadow under lock and key. Edward II's reign is remembered today not for conquest or reform, but for its sheer disconnect from reality. He ruled like a man trying to build stability out of wet sand. He mistook loyalty for friendship, responsibility for suggestion, and leadership for pageantry. And in the end, he became a cautionary tale about what happens when the crown lands on someone who just doesn't want the job, unless it involves crafts. Still, if Edward played in the sand, the next monarch nearly lost himself in the mud, literally. Because James II, in a moment that perfectly captures royal absurdity, once got lost on a fox hunt and had to sleep in a farmer's barn, too proud to admit he didn't know the way back. 25. James II. There are many ways for a king to lose his throne: military defeat, political miscalculation, widespread rebellion. But James II, true to form, managed to undermine his rule in a far more poetic way, by getting hopelessly lost on a fox hunt, refusing to ask for directions, and spending the night in a random farmer's barn. It was, in a way, the perfect preview of his entire reign, misguided, proud, and unable to admit when he'd gone completely off course. Born in 1633, James was the younger brother of Charles II and the second surviving son of the ill-fated Charles I. He grew up during the English Civil War, went into exile after his father's execution, and spent years bouncing between European courts, quietly nursing grievances and admiring the efficiency of absolute monarchies. When the monarchy was restored in 1660, he returned with his brother and was given the traditional consolation prize for second-born royals, the title of Duke of York, and a career in the military. He wasn't a terrible naval commander, at least not by the standards of the Restoration Court, where showing up on time and not sinking the fleet qualified as exemplary service. But beneath the powdered wigs and medals, James carried a deeply inflexible worldview. He believed in divine right. He believed in monarchy. And, most problematically for a Protestant nation still scarred by the Reformation, he believed in Catholicism. Not just quietly, not politely, but loudly and stubbornly, even when it was politically suicidal. When Charles II died in 1685, James inherited the throne without serious challenge, initially. Many hoped he would rule with the same cynical pragmatism as his brother, keeping his religious beliefs private while upholding the Church of England. But James, ever the optimist in the worst way, took his coronation as a sign that God and history were on his side. He immediately began trying to turn England back toward Catholicism. He appointed Catholics to high office. He issued the Declaration of Indulgence, suspending penal laws against Catholics and dissenting Protestants. He attempted to pack Parliament with loyalists. He demanded that Anglican clergy read his declarations aloud in churches, and then arrested the bishops who refused. Subtlety was not his strong suit. And still, James thought everything was fine, because he believed that power, once acquired, was permanent. That people would obey him because he was the king. That logic and loyalty would fall neatly in line behind faith and family. And then came the Glorious Revolution. In 1688, his Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband, William of Orange, were invited by Parliament to invade. Not exactly a vote of confidence. William landed with a relatively small force, expecting resistance. Instead, James's own army and allies began defecting, one by one. His support collapsed so quickly, it was almost abstract. But before his fall from power, there was that fox hunt. At some point during the political unraveling, James reportedly went out riding, perhaps to clear his head, perhaps to pretend the country wasn't falling apart, and promptly got lost in the English countryside. Too proud to ask for help, too directionally challenged to find his way home, he ended up sleeping in a barn, cold and alone, while the nation quietly organized his replacement. It's the kind of metaphor that writes itself. A king in a haystack, wrapped in royal entitlement, snoring beneath the rafters as his reign evaporated without ceremony. When James finally returned to London, it was too late. His wife and infant son had already fled. William was closing in. Rather than face deposition directly, James tried to escape, twice. The first time he was caught by fishermen near Faversham. The second time he succeeded, fleeing to France under the protection of Louis XIV. There, in exile, James lived out the rest of his life insisting he was still the rightful king. He prayed, he plotted, he wrote bitter letters. But England had moved on. His daughter and son-in-law ruled in his place. Parliament reasserted its supremacy. The Glorious Revolution was, for England, bloodless and final. For James, it was just a long, awkward ending to a reign marked by relentless misjudgment. And so he passed into history, not as a tyrant or a visionary, but as a monarch who mistook stubbornness for strength and pride for principle. A man who lost his kingdom the same way he lost his bearings, quietly, comically, and completely. And with that, our strange royal journey draws to a close. 25 royals, each one a monument to misunderstanding their role, their people, or, most often, themselves. From coronation hangovers to battlefield poodles, from sandcastle fortresses to fox hunt exiles, one thing becomes clear. Royalty, despite its ceremonies and crowns, has never been immune to absurdity. If anything, it breeds it.